I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture. Hey, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
So we are back with another one of my favorite topics, which is all things esoteric, weird, clairvoyant. And you may have been aware already, there's a huge podcast out right now called Telepathy Tapes. If it's not number one, it's at least top 10 trending podcasts. And I binged this in like 2 days, went for walks, just listened to Telepathy Tapes. I'd been hearing some chatter about it because of the alien UFO news that's been going on with the drones. And people in the comments on these videos were like, well, between this and Telepathy Tapes, I feel like something's happening. And I'm like, what the hell is this Telepathy Tapes thing? It is a podcast that dives into nonverbal autistic children who are said to have telepathic abilities with their caretakers, with their parents. And we'll get into all the details, but that's what you need to know for now. I found this incredibly interesting. It goes very much in line with all of my weird woo-woo shit that I love. And when I was telling Lucy about it, she was like, okay, I'm going to binge it too, and we'll talk about it on the pod.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Here we are. I'm excited. I binged it all this past couple days, so it's very fresh in my mind. When did you listen to this?
Good. I finished it last week, so it's also fresh in my mind. I'm really glad I discovered it after all the episodes were out, because I hate when you have to wait like a week, which, sorry for all of our listeners that actually keep up with us. I know it's hard to wait 2 weeks, but I can't wait a week for a podcast to come out. Like when it's a story like that, oh my God.
Yeah. For those who haven't heard it, it's documentary style.
Yeah.
And the host, she's a journalist / documentary filmmaker. And she really takes you on a journey. After listening to episode 1, I did not expect where we were going to end up by the end of season 1.
No. So where we start off is Kai, who's the producer and the documentarian. She finds these nonverbal autistic children and they are said to have psychic abilities, and she wants to test this out for herself. And so she goes down and tries to videotape them speaking telepathically with their caretakers. And she conducts a whole slew of experiments in episodes 1 and 2. And most of these children are communicating with their caretakers through something called spelling. And spelling is a very controversial way for nonverbal children to communicate because it often involves an adult or a caretaker touching them or like some sort of assistance in them spelling out on a board what they're trying to say. And so skeptics, which is most of the scientific community and most speech pathologists that help them communicate, are pretty against this method of communication because there's no real way to know if you are subconsciously or consciously cueing the child to spell what they're trying to spell or if it's really them. So that's where the controversy lies in this first few episodes. And so she's trying to go in and be like, are these children being cued? How accurate are their telepathic abilities? And what I found really interesting about this is in our last episode that was released, we talked about Happiness Falls as one of our favorite books of last year. And this made me think of Happiness Falls so much because in that book, it centers around a child with Angelman syndrome, and he's nonverbal and he spells in the book to eventually communicate with his family. But they go pretty in depth into the controversy around spelling there because earlier in the kid's life, he was spelling with his parents, and then it was found out that this was not a viable way of communicating. And so they really get into like the weeds of why that is and like the subconscious cueing and stuff. But I was like, oh, this ties in so well. It's something that we both read.
Yeah. Definitely brought me back to reading that book as well. A lot of nonverbal autistic kids struggle with motor coordination and motor function. And so part of the communication barrier is just like moving their hands, moving their limbs. So the original form of spelling, which is the colloquial term that evolved, was where an aid was supporting their arm. So they were putting pressure against their arm so that the person trying to communicate would press down, like with oppositional pressure, and then essentially take a pencil and like try to stab it through a letter board. So that is what they're using to communicate. And the letters are really big, spaced out. Often it's not the full alphabet. So it is a specific set of letters. So that's also where some of the critique comes in, is because there is like selection happening.
Why is that controversial? Like, I understand the subconscious cueing aspect of it. That seems really obvious because, I mean, for our listeners, what the critique is there's the person helping for their motor function. They know what the answer is in their head. So when the non-speaking person puts their cueing utensil over the correct letter, they may subconsciously be like applying some pressure to the arm or like tapping, or you aren't doing this on purpose, but you may be doing it. And then the nonverbal person picks up on it and like taps the letter. That's the critique. But I don't find this compelling in the slightest. And so I'm curious what the actual problem with like only having certain letters and.
Yeah, so I mean, I am by no means an expert in this, but I did specifically look into this area because it's something I've been curious about, honestly, since I read Happiness Falls, because they cover it, but more in like a fictional context. And what I did in preparation for this episode was like actually look at some of the research behind it and like what the scientific community is saying. And also like what the Telepathy Tapes is saying in response to that, because they're on one side of the issue, and then the scientific community and ASHA, which is the American Speech Language Hearing Association, they're on another side, which is that they're against spelling. Mm-hmm. So the history of spelling originated with facilitated communication, abbreviated as FC, and that emerged in the 1970s. And this was largely discredited after, quote, message passing tests failed. Originally, the claim was, okay, minimally verbal autistic people are communicating and they can answer questions. They then did a bunch of studies, tests, and the conclusion was they can only answer questions correctly if their facilitators are privy to the answers beforehand. Okay. So they were not able to communicate things that their facilitators did not know. And so these tests basically, for the scientific community, they were like, debunked. This is pseudoscience. It's not the autistic person speaking. It is the facilitator speaking, whether intentionally, which there was like a very prominent court case where there was an aide who was doing this technique with an autistic person, and allegations came out about sexual abuse related to their family. Mm-hmm. And it was proven that this was unreliable evidence. Even in the podcast, the Telepathy Tapes, the host, Kai, recognizes that this facilitated communication, which is the one where, as I mentioned, you're putting like actual pressure on their arm or their hand, it is a little sus. And she recognizes that too, as like, you might not believe, because sometimes it's quite a lot of pressure. Like you can like literally see that they're almost, it seems like they're kind of moving their hand. I mean, it depends obviously on different people and their ability level. The next kind of evolution of spelling is fairly new. It is called RPM, which stands for Rapid Prompting Method. And this I thought was more interesting. I guess for me, I kind of agree that FC seems a little sus. I can see the validity in the concerns with it. The difference with RPM is nobody is touching the autistic speaker. So they are still holding a letter board. And I watched like a lot of videos of this. There is prompting. Like if the autistic person is having trouble controlling their body, they will like move the board, take a break for a second, and then bring the board back. Or I've seen people even cue and be like, up, 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 which obviously I'm like, okay, why are you telling them to go up? Like you're changing the letter maybe that they were going to pick. But that doesn't happen 100% of the time. Like I've also seen videos where somebody is using the letter board and the board is moving extremely minimally and the person is pointing and spelling like very, very quickly. So it seems like pretty impossible that there could be some sort of manipulation in that. So that is the new version of spelling that advocates have like a lot of hope that this will be accepted because there is no physical contact. However, ASHA did come out in 2018 saying that they had done an exhaustive review and found that RPM lacked sufficient scientific evidence and that it was potentially harmful. Their main concerns are these four things. One, uncertainty regarding who does the spelling. So we kind of already covered that one. Two, they argue that RPM creates a dependence on another person because someone is holding the board.
Okay. So?
Right. So their argument is independence is the most important thing. And the reliance on RPM doesn't train the autistic speaker to eventually stop needing somebody to hold the board.
That seems ableist. Sorry.
Whereas, like, I guess other forms of using letterboards, there's like other techniques that use similar props. Those are more focused on like eventually the person can independently operate. There's like truly no interference with another human.
Okay.
Okay, their third argument is that it just lacks evidence and there's not a lot of research on this technique. And in general, when there's been pushes to have more research, the response from RPM proponents has always been, we don't want to do that because it will put children in stressful testing situations and it's just kind of demeaning, insulting at all to even question if people are competent or not. And then number four, is the concern that RPM can potentially be harmful because it opens people up to scams. It's not actually scientifically proven. People who are like peddling solutions for this are maybe doing it not out of goodwill, but just because they want money and they know that these families are like very hopeful, very desperate. They've often been turned away from many existing solutions, and people are asked to pay money for the tools here and to like travel really far for training and all of these things. So that is the rationale that Asha uses. And their language is pretty strong. Like they really, really, really do not recommend it, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I got that from the Telepathy Tapes too. Like I didn't do independent research like you did on this specific topic, but from the Telepathy Tapes, and I've worked with, I think I told you I babysat children in the past who are like minimally verbal autistic children. And I have like worked with Easter SEALs and like other adult mental disability organizations before. So like I feel like I have like a decent life experience with this. And they don't give you a lot of options though. That's the thing. It's like these organizations are shitting all over these solutions. And then they're like, well, there's no evidence and people are scamming you. And they're like, okay, well, what are you trying to do? It's like, we're going to read them coloring books and like the ABCs for 18 years while they're in school. And then your parents are going to take care of you until you die. And that's your solution. That's your life. Anything else is a scam.
Yeah.
And it's like, what the hell do you expect these? Like, obviously, they're going to go out and try to find other, like, more enriching things for their children. I feel like so many parents are so frustrated with these big organizations being like, no, everything you're doing is actually a scam and not right. And so, I don't know. I'm curious, were they like providing alternate methodologies here? Or were they just like everything that's spelling or assisted communication in any capacity isn't valid because it's assisted? And we have no scientific method in which to test if it's actually the autistic person speaking exclusively.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very similar thought, which is like, well, what else are they supposed to do?
Right.
I guess their alternative is they call it AAC, which stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. And I guess this encompasses a variety of low-tech communication boards and high-tech speech-generating devices. And it can include an alphabet board, very similar to spelling. And it also can include prompts and other instructional techniques similar to spelling. So I was like, okay, what is the difference then? And they had this chart with like pros and cons for each of these methods. And they were advocating for this because it's more of the independence angle, that the goal ultimately here is to train people towards independence. And again, their claim at least is that RPM does not, because it's fully reliant on your caretaker essentially being the interpreter, holding the board. There's no training within the RPM methodology to eventually like wean the person off using the letterboard held by someone.
So it's okay if it's like a computer helping them, but just not another human being. Is that the angle? Because like a computer is neutral theoretically.
Yeah.
And, like another human being could
Yes.
mess with the interpretations.
The concern with Asha is definitely the insertion of another human.
Okay. I still think it's bullshit. I get the concern, but in the telepathy tapes that they were not Kai either. It's like the autistic people and the caretakers were explaining it, where autistic people have a difficult time understanding where their body is in space.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of checks out. And I think that's pretty scientifically accurate too, that like there's sensory issues to the max. And the act of touching them, even a little bit, like on their shoulder, on their forehead, helps them ground themselves enough to be able to have control over their body. So if you're thinking about it that way, is like the mere fact of having another human being touch you, even if it's not like directing your arm, that you're going to invalidate the entire thing because there's another human involved. I'm like, that feels a little ableist to me. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It just does.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I mean, obviously the telepathy tapes has its own biases and point of view, right? And I think having listened to those episodes, if I had not also like had a little bit of prior knowledge from reading Happiness Falls, the book, or looked up videos myself, I don't think I would have even realized. Like, they don't describe the spelling process in the podcast. I didn't understand prior to watching the videos that someone was holding a letterboard.
Mm-hmm.
They just like gloss over that. So I think they probably are aware that as soon as somebody hears, oh, well, there's someone holding the letterboard, that immediately the skeptic in most people is going to be like, oh, well, it's not really independent. It's not really like accurate. And I did a fair bit of digging in this area and was trying to just figure out like, okay, what do I believe? Like, I've heard both sides of the story. And I will say that I think the advocates for RPM could be doing more if they really wanted the scientific community to accept them. To give you an example, I continuously saw the same evidence being presented by the pro folks, and it seemed like the challenges against their arguments could be almost easily disproven if they were only willing to let it happen. And so to concretely like explain what I mean. So before I even looked at what the telepathy tapes had linked on their website in the resources section. I did a basic Google search like anybody curious about this topic would. And the first hit I got was a research study by Vikram Jaswal, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. This is supposedly the most pro and widely accepted research about this. He looked at a group of 9 nonverbal/minimally verbal autistic children, and he did a eye test measure where I think it's like some sort of headgear type machine where it measures your eye movement. And so the study was observing the kids spelling while wearing this device, and he found that it was impossible that there was prompting because their eyes were just moving too rapidly. There could be no like implicit cueing from the person holding the board because the eyes were moving as if anybody's would if they were typing or writing on a piece of paper and they were able-bodied. So that was his article, and then like the telepathy tapes references that. Now the critique against this study is Catherine Beals basically wrote a response to Jaswal's study. Her first point is your sample size is 9, and then also out of those 9, all but 1 were high functioning enough where they were able to communicate already. Like they were able to form sentences. So of course, if you measure their eye movements, they wouldn't be reliant on prompting. Like they can understand and they can communicate. So that was her first critique. Her second critique was, hey, in the past, people have challenged the pro community by saying, if you really want to convince us, do this message passing test because we believe in the message passing test. That was the test that essentially invalidated FC back in the day. And the response from the pro community has always been, we don't want to do that test. It's extremely stressful for participants involved. And so her second point was like, don't you think tracking their eye movement and having them wear this complicated headgear is also stressful? Like, why are you not willing to just prove your point a little farther and like go that little extra step if it's really scientifically sound? It just feels like a weird place to stop was kind of her point.
Why do they think that message passing is so stressful?
I mean, you kind of hear this in the telepathy tapes too. I feel like she tries to make this excuse when things, I mean, obviously they don't like capture any of the mistakes, quote unquote, on tape. She's like, everybody's 100% accurate is like her message. And then obviously the example she shows you, they are 100% accurate. But if you recall, she says sometimes like, oh, this person can't be telepathic if they don't have the right energy or if they're not open to it. Like openness is really important. Or if they're stressed. So I think that's like a similar argument for why they don't want to do the message testing, is it puts the participants under a lot of stress. But yeah, I find that a little hard to buy. I'm like, why not just let them do it? Dude, in the podcast, they were hooking people up to EEGs. Surely that's also stressful.
Yeah, I don't know. I can kind of see why. I mean, obviously being like a woo-woo person that I am, I do think there's something to be said for being like closed off to energies and that affecting things. And there's this article that was written that you cued me to, written by somebody at McGill University. Basically, he took down the telepathy tapes and was like, this is complete BS.
Yeah.
He used like very kind of like entertainment language to be like, this entire podcast is bullshit. So it wasn't scientific, respectfully written. It was kind of like, do you believe in fairies? Because you must if you believe in the telepathy tapes. So I didn't love his tone, which is why I'm like, okay, you have like almost seemingly a personal vendetta here. Like, what happened to you, buddy? Like, who hurt you? But one of the articles that he references, he's talking about psyops and psychological telepathic tests that happen both in the CIA and at universities throughout the decades that like are very inconsistent, like so inconsistent to the point where somebody actually wrote a scientific article saying that there must be some sort of mythological trickster that is interfering with psyops. And that's why we can't actually produce consistent tests. And he's like, basically, you have to be this stupid to believe this shit. And so I clicked on the article and it linked to the PDF to this scientific research paper about trickster mythology. And I don't know, it wasn't that crazy. Like the way that he was framing this person's research was like, you have to be a fucking moron. And this guy is not saying that at all. I think, again, like the problem here is that he did use the literal words. Like throughout history, we've had this idea of like a mythological trickster, like think Loki. He didn't actually say Loki, but that was what was in my mind. And he's like, that concept can help us understand why we're not able to like reproduce consistently. And then he turns that into like, you literally have to believe in mythological creatures if you want to like believe in the validity of this stuff. So I don't know. I think people who are against it are so eager to be against it, and people who are for it are so eager to be for it, that there's not a lot of communication happening across lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I found the same thing. I'm glad you looked into the footnotes because I read that article too. And interestingly enough, I read that article before I finished the podcast. So I was like, oh shit, is this going to bias me? Because I was like one episode in and I went to the Telepathy Tapes podcast to go watch the footage that she always references. If you don't believe her, like go watch the tapes for yourself and be amazed. And I was like, oh, this is behind a paywall. Like, has anyone else watched this? And that's how I came across this article because he watched it. And his critique of those videos was like, I watched it. I don't believe it. Like, these are not full clips. They're, you know, the person is moving the thing. You know, all the controversy we already talked about with spelling. And it's interesting because then I did watch the tapes. Like, a YouTuber did an interview with her and she included clips in that video. But I watched the clips and I was like, I find these pretty persuasive. Like, yeah, I mean, I was like, I hear you. Like, they are short clips. It's not like she has an hour of footage where you can really be like, they tested 20 times and accuracy was 20 out of 20. But when I was looking at the tapes, you know, he's like, oh, well, in one of the tests, the mom has her finger on the girl's forehead. And it's true. Like, he's correct objectively. But when you read that on paper, you're like, oh, well, then of course she's being manipulated. And then you watch the video and you're like, the speed at which the communication is happening, I just have a really hard time understanding or believing how that would be manipulated. Like, yes, the touching is happening, but people are spelling very, very quickly. Like, you'd have to be like, oh, no, not that letter, like this other letter, and it would have to happen all in like milliseconds. And I really, it depends, because there were some clips I saw where I was like, there really seems like there's no manipulation there. Other clips where I was like, okay, that one seems like a little bit more suspicious, but it's more about like the fact that, yeah, because the sides are so polarized, you have to just like pick one and then believe everything that side has to say. There's no like room for gray.
There has to be room for gray. Nuance is everything. But again, I don't know what the people who are so skeptical believe that the mental capacity of autistic people are. Like, I don't know if they believe they're not actually in there, that they can't talk, that they don't have the ability to, or that we just haven't come across a method for them to speak themselves yet that works for them. I don't know. But what I think is really interesting is they seem to be in the camp of those kids aren't actually in there. They're children. That's why we teach them as if they're toddlers. But they're going to attest that they're intelligent enough and like perceptive enough and subtle enough to understand this like little like minuscule tapping to like make these complex messages. Pick a side, fuckers. What do you think? Do you think they're like incapable, or do you think they're like massively, I don't know. I find that like very unconvincing personally.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because that YouTube video I found where they were interviewing Kai mentions actually, she was like, I looked into the history of sign language and the history of Braille, and it took hundreds of years for even those methods to be accepted. And it just seems like in general, like able-bodied people like to take away communication methods from those who are different from them. And I was like, okay, I need to fact check like literally everything because I've become so suspicious. So I did, I fact checked it. And she's kind of right. It's not hundreds of years, but like, sign language started to get adopted in the 1700s. Then it was actually banned in 1880. I had no idea that was true. Yeah.
Why?
Okay, so in the 1700s, you see like a handful of schools for the deaf being opened. In 1880, the International Congress on the Education of the Deaf met in Milan. It was 164 educators, only one of them being deaf. And they passed a resolution removing the use of sign language from deaf education, period. They said only oralists in the classroom. And then it took another 100 years for sign language to be accepted.
Oh my God.
So yeah, and with RPM, it only started getting more into the mainstream in like 2001. So I feel like this is just like history repeating itself, you know, like, yes, it's not accepted right now. Maybe it'll be like sign language, it'll take 100 years. Braille, the inventor of Braille, Louis Braille, for his school to even adopt it, it took 30 years. And then it took another approximately 90 years for the whole English speaking world to kind of accept it. So it just seems like these things take time and there's always skepticism. But when I heard that, because I feel like nowadays, if anybody was like, I'm against Braille or I'm against sign language, you'd be like, you're the crazy one.
Yeah.
So I do think that's interesting because right now, you know, the quote crazy people are the ones advocating for RPM. And if maybe it's just an issue of not enough time passing, you know?
Totally. Who knows? I mean, I hope that's the case. Or I hope that we figure out a way to help them communicate truly independently so there are no skeptics anymore. Like, if it is a question of touching so they can ground themselves in their body, I don't know, is there a way you could use like weighted blankets or like some sort of like electro pulses or like something that doesn't require another human being? I think that's sad. I hope that we get to a point where we can accept another person touching them, but like just to get past the hurdle of, is this scientifically proven?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there other ways?
Yeah, it's so hard.
did you find the telepathy tapes, like just in general, trustworthy? Like what was like your general vibe?
My experience with the first few episodes differed a lot with the ending episodes. I think actually in the first few episodes, I was more persuaded. I mean, one, we haven't even mentioned that she references a doctor throughout the show, Dr. Powell, who Kai ends up meeting with first before she even gets in touch with any of these families. And often the doctor does accompany her in doing some of these tests. So she kind of, definitely in episode 1, I feel like she leaned on that doctor's reputation. She like mentioned she was on the staff at Harvard and is like a neuroscientist and has a PhD and all of these things as like a source of legitimacy. And this person really believes in this work. Like she's been doing this work for a while. She has a book about it, etc. And so I guess I felt like episodes 1 and 2, Kai was making a lot of effort into trying to come off as objective. And she was also highlighting the fact that she brought a lot of skeptics with her on these tests and then interviewing them after the fact. And they would be like, wow, my mind is blown. I'm changing my mind. And she also spent a lot of time covering the fact that she found a new family that Dr. Powell never even engaged with, so there could be no collusion there. She brought her own equipment. They removed all reflective devices from the room. They even removed TVs. She would bring a book from home that no one had ever seen if she was trying to like test what the page said and if there was a telepathic connection there. I feel like she was really trying to assure probably what she thought was her audience of skeptics that everybody had good intentions. She kept repeating, the doctor, I promise you she's ethical. Like she clearly has good intentions. Whereas I feel like by the end of the podcast, there was a point where she was like, if you made it this far and you haven't listened to the earlier episodes, I really recommend you start there. Because I think she kind of did less of that as the show went on. And the topics got a lot more wild. Like we start with telepathy, but then we're moving into like a ton of different psi phenomenon in terms of clairvoyance, in terms of heaven, seeing dead people. I don't know. It just like, for me, I was like, okay, I'm starting to like both lose interest, but also not really believe in this level. Like, do I think that there are things I don't understand? Of course. And like the first few episodes, if it had ended there, I probably would have been like, yeah, I believe that there's something happening if like there's all these families who I don't think the families are lying. Like, I think they're experiencing something that can't be explained, and that's fine. We can't explain everything.
It's when it like took the left turn into like heaven and all of that.
Yeah, then I was like, okay, now this feels like I'm listening to some either religious podcast or like something else.
Yeah, I didn't feel like it went religious because I think she was pretty adamant about being like, this isn't like a religious thing. And like whatever you think is spiritual about this is more has to do with maybe a collective energy. And like she tries to tie it into quantum physics, perhaps, or like something that's more like could be based in science that we just like don't quite understand, but is being explored. And like that is where my woo-woo comes in. I'm more of like a metaphysical woo-woo person where I was like, I think eventually we're going to be able to explain all this shit with science. We just can't do it yet. And what I loved about the podcast is she talks about materialists, meaning people who like basically if you can't explain it with the science that we have now, if you can't observe it, if you can't test it with the scientific method, even though we see it playing out, it doesn't exist and I'm going to invalidate you. And that's like the materialist view. Whereas a metaphysical view would say, okay, we kind of have a very strong inkling that this is happening. There's anecdotal evidence we can observe. We kind of know it's happening. We can't explain why yet, but that doesn't mean it's not real. And I take on that view of things more so than the materialist view. So her explanation of like, okay, quantum entanglement, different dimensions, time, space, fields, all of that makes more sense to me than just being like, oh, there's like some spiritual realm and like God is out there and like our souls, like all of that like does not resonate as much personally.
Yeah.
But anyway, when she was taking the metaphysical route, I was like, okay, cool. Like I'm on board with this. That didn't turn me off. What turned me off towards the end was when like she at the beginning was very selective about which families she was talking to.
Yeah.
And like would do her due diligence and be like, we're going to do these experiments. We're really going to make sure they know what they're talking about. They're not just like spewing some BS. And I think what happened is, and again, this happens in both metaphysical communities and scientific communities, I think. People get very attached to their belief systems. And I think she got attached to this idea that telepathy was out there, that all autistic children can communicate telepathically. And so she's going to listen to every single one of these stories and validate them. And she had these people writing in that were like, I listened to your episode and I talked to my child and all of a sudden I could speak to them. And this is the message that they told me. And it was a message that was like using TikTok language. I'm like, I don't think your child is saying that. Like, it was like, I just want people to know just because I'm not able-bodied doesn't mean I'm not empowered or something like that. I'm like, that's a poster. Like your child didn't, that's you saying that. And I was like, this is like so clearly Whereas at the beginning, the messages that telepathically were being communicated by the very vetted families were like, they speak in an extremely poetic language that is very different than any verbal person would say. And the messages at the end were literally like empowerment posters or like something you would see on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. And I was like, I'm not buying this shit. But I think it's like a function of believing so much that like you're like, I'm going to be 100% in on this and like not be skeptical anymore. And like, it's unfortunate. But that doesn't mean I'm going to like throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I think there were some nuggets of truth in there. She just got a little like overboard. I think it did lose credibility at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. I feel like she did a poor job presenting the metaphysical arguments or the scientific arguments. Like, I more got the vibe that she kind of had lost her own objectivity because of the people that she spent a lot of time with. I'm not saying she's very religious, but like people she featured in these long segments, long interviews in the podcast, they were really religious. Like there was that evangelical mom in America, and then she also had an interview with someone who had moved back to Israel, and his son was, I mean, his telepathy was being interpreted as like almost prophecies. Yeah. And being sent to the community. So it was like, okay, the fact that you're giving that so much airtime is interesting to me.
Well, do you think that because they're religious, their stories aren't real?
No, I mean, I'm not saying that, but I think the angle changed. Like, I think in the beginning it was like, there's this phenomena, telepathy, that's happening where the way we're testing it is through multiplication on a calculator, showing that to the mom, and then can the kid tell you what the mom just saw on the calculator? Or using Uno cards. And I think by the end, a lot of the quote proof she was presenting was more like, they're just like connected to God or like heaven, or like my child gave me a message from God that was like, God gives such great gifts, was one quote I remember. I felt like that was being brought in more and more. And then especially there was an episode towards the end where one of the autistic children actually passes away. And he is in the afterlife, and there's a whole episode about how all these people who didn't know him in real life are able to connect with him in the afterlife and then know things about him that they couldn't possibly know. To me, I'm like, that's also feels like religious in a way, like that you even believe there is an afterlife.
Maybe. I don't know. I think I've been in this world a little too long, so I don't see it that way. Because like in the metaphysical community, like when you're outside of it, God sounds like, oh, they're talking about Christianity or like Abrahamic religion on some capacity. But there's not a good word. That's why some people say like the universe or spirit or like collective consciousness. Or like there's a lot of different words to use for it. But to me, that's what I was hearing when she was saying like, I think she even like dives pretty deeply into saying she's not using heaven to mean biblical heaven, but like this idea of like a perfect place, and like it has traditional roots in like every single society. And like this is pretty widely accepted thing in like all of human culture and tradition, that there's like some concept of heaven, and it's not tied to biblical truth at all. So I think her language was it was definitely irresponsible, because obviously if you don't come from a metaphysical background, you're going to hear heaven and you're going to hear God and you'll be like, oh my God, this person is trying to spew religion. But I think what she was trying to do was like tap into like the collective consciousness aspect of it that is more akin to clairvoyance, psychic ability, that potentially has some scientific grounding in a way through like quantum physics and things that people are actually studying. And I'll get into it. The CIA is even studying, or studied in the past tense, well, allegedly past tense. Anyway, all of this can tie into things that are like grounded either in reality or are interesting enough to non-religious people to actually like invest $20 million in and study. But the language that you use has to be really careful, because it's very easy to cross over into like, now we're just being like woo-woo religious people rather than like trying to explore unseen phenomena that science can't explain yet.
Yeah, I would say for me, it definitely crossed into that line. Yeah, I agree. Like she had the option not to. I don't know why she stopped interviewing other types of sources. Like even if she had wanted to present those voices, just to have like another more scientific perspective would have been helpful to kind of counterbalance that. I just felt like it became very one note the second half of the podcast. And I was like, oh, you're very convinced and you're kind of presenting now what you believe.
Yeah, exactly. No, I felt that way too. Even as somebody who's like into this, I was like, ooh, you kind of like you lost the plot a little bit here. Like you're like really deep into this. We can't be objective anymore. Damn it.
Yeah. Wait, but tell me about this CIA thing.
Oh, well. So there was a project. The CIA had a PSYOPs investigation project. This was born out of the Cold War, because apparently Russia was doing, and honestly Nazi Germany too. Like they were interested in clairvoyance and what we call remote viewing. I'll get into the definition of that. They were interested basically in, are there supernatural psychic abilities that we can tap into for national security, military, domestic defense purposes? So the CIA starts Stargate project in 1977 in response to Russia looking into this during the Cold War. It started in Fort Meade, Maryland, and the purpose was to investigate psychic phenomena in military and domestic applications. The main focus here was remote viewing. And you can basically just think of this as like, is there a scientific way to approach clairvoyance? Like, can we approach this in a structured way where I ask you to view? They actually tried to do this with the Iranian hostage crisis during Jimmy Carter's administration. So the application there was like, can you tell us what's going on in the room? And use a psychic to do that. So at peak manpower, there were 22 active military and civilian remote viewers providing data to the CIA.
Interesting.
Fascinating. Yeah, they were paid $500,000 a year.
Great. Especially back then.
Yep. There's not a ton known about the project. Like, you can view all of this online because it was declassified in 1995 after the CIA declared they weren't really able to use anything useful in a real intelligence operation, even though they were trying. Nothing was really working, so they terminated. There were only 3 clairvoyants in use at that time in 1995 when the program went debunk. But since they declassified everything, you can literally go on the CIA website and read the files. And there was like a 16-page PDF that I glossed through. Honestly, the CIA needs a new type font because it's very difficult to read the documents. But I did my best. And there's not really anything super interesting in there. I feel like they have a lot more documentation that didn't get made public, or like maybe you just need to dig a lot more than I did. But essentially, they tried a bunch of experiments and it was very, very hit or miss. Sometimes it was very accurate what the people were seeing. Sometimes it wasn't, but there was no way to get clear enough messages to be actionable was the problem. Like, they could kind of like hindsight 2020 it a little bit and be like, oh yeah, that was actually true. But you're giving me such a vague message that I can't act on it in the here and now. And it kind of reminds me of our Nostradamus episode where it's like, oh, do we really expect them to have like crystal clear messages about the future? Like, maybe not.
Wait, so the 22 participants, these were established known clairvoyants, or they were just normal people and the CIA was training them, or they were trying to come up with some sort of scientific training methodology to turn them into seers?
There was like a mix.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, they were trying to see if you could make people become clairvoyant and tap into those abilities. And then there were people who were claimed to be clairvoyant who were working with them.
Okay, all right. So people in the CIA clearly believed enough to do this operation.
Yep. There was an interesting little paragraph about the overall conclusion of Stargate that I want to read. So in the declassified documents, they say, the foregoing observations provide a compelling argument against continuation of the program within the intelligence community. Even though a statistically significant effect has been observed in the laboratory, it remains unclear whether the existence of a paranormal phenomenon, remote viewing, has been demonstrated. The laboratory studies do not provide evidence regarding the origins or nature of the phenomenon, assuming it exists, nor do they address an important methodological issue of interjudge reliability. So basically, this just means like, we can see that it's happening. It's not reliable. We can't provide you a scientific method for which to test this. Further, even if it could be demonstrated unequivocally that a paranormal phenomenon occurs under the conditions present in the laboratory paradigm, these conditions have limited applicability and utility for intelligence gathering operations. For example, the nature of the remote viewing targets are vastly dissimilar, as are the specific tasks required of the remote viewers. Most importantly, the information provided by remote viewing is vague and ambiguous, making it difficult, if not impossible, for the technique to yield information for sufficient quality and accuracy of information for actionable intelligence. Thus, we conclude that continued use of remote viewing in intelligence gathering operations is not warranted. So to me, this did not say like, this was totally failed. Mm-hmm. I did not get that vibe from reading the documents. It was like, not worth the millions of dollars that we're putting into because we can't act on it, but there might be something here.
Yeah, I mean, they said there was something statistically significant happening. They just didn't know what.
Or how to wield it, basically. They had somebody working with tarot cards to try to tell the CIA what was going on.
Oh my gosh.
Which is wild.
So
wild.
funny.
But I found it interesting that not only were the CIA doing this, but like Russia's doing this too. Like, we don't even know what other countries are doing this. I'm sure like many a country has clairvoyance working for them. And it's not uncommon for police investigators to use clairvoyance too in like missing persons cases.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
What? Like they go to they go to the local mystic? What do you mean? I didn't know that.
There are clairvoyants that work with police. they'll be like, hey, we have a missing persons case. We need your help. And they'll be like, okay. God, you must not watch true crime TV.
I mean, I watch true crime documentaries. I feel like I've never seen that mentioned.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the telepathy tapes, it started with telepathy, but it also got into all of this too. Like it got into clairvoyance, seeing the past, seeing the future, all of this. And are these things always inevitably linked? Like, is that why she took it there? Because I feel like as a skeptic here, you tell me like one thing, okay, I'm just starting to maybe absorb it. You then add like 10 more things on top of that I think are all not real. And it starts to become like harder to swallow. So I was just even curious about that decision she made to then pile on. Like, why not just make season 1 just about telepathy instead of like introducing 8 more side concepts, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that would probably work better to make herself feel more credible. But I kind of get it too, because it's like the story is so much bigger than that. Even in the first 2 or 3 episodes where she is just trying to study telepathy, they start talking about meeting on the hill and like the autistic children talking to each other. And you're like, oh, what is that about?
Yeah.
And the hill, for those who haven't listened, is this place where it's not a physical place. It's a mental place that the nonverbal people access through their mind. And they kind of are like spiritually present there, and they communicate there in their mind. And it kind of starts as just this gathering place, but then it turns into an idea of heaven where they're like actually getting taught things at the hill by guides and angels and spirits.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then there's like a bonus episode. Did you listen to the bonus episode of the verbal person who went to the hill?
No.
Yeah, there's an episode that dropped last week, and it was a guy who had cancer. I think he had brain cancer. He was doing a ton of meditation to help with his cancer. Like basically he was terminal and they were like, you're going to die. But so he was trying alternate methods. He did so much meditation, and I think he was working with the autistic nonverbal children too. And he like knew about the hill from that. And he went to the hill in his meditations. And so he told one of the kids he was working with, he was like, okay, I'm going to tell you something here. And then when I see you tomorrow at school, tell me what I'm telling you here so I know that this is real and not just like me making shit up. And the kid told him at school.
Mm-hmm.
I think he told him his mom's name. I think that's what it was.
Okay.
So I don't know. You got to listen to the episode, but that's what they're like, okay, it's this metaphysical place that you can access through meditation. Like anyone can access it, but the nonverbal children have more of a connection because they're not connected to their bodies is the idea.
Yeah, she's like, it's tuning into a radio channel if you're like able to access it. It's funny because looking back, I was willing to go on this journey with her in the early episodes, but I feel like at so many points, she just tried to make such strong statements where I was like, do you not remember what it was like before you were in this world? Like she was like 100% of autistic children are telepathic. She would ask the child and the child would be like, yes, everybody can. And then she would repeat 100% of autistic children can do this. Because at one point earlier, I was potentially persuaded by this argument, which she was like, Savant Syndrome is well accepted by the medical scientific community. It's rare, but there are autistic and non-autistic people who experience Savant Syndrome, which is when they, despite a serious mental disability, they have some sort of island of genius, which makes them incredible at a specific thing. It's usually like music or math or occasionally language learning, like being a polyglot. But it's very rare. I mean, it's like debated how rare. Like older studies have said it was like maybe 10%. That seems really high to me. More recent studies have shown it being more like 1 to 2%.
But it's real.
It's real. It's like real. Scientifically accepted,
Yes.
right? And so, whereas obviously telepathy is not. And she was originally making the argument, we should think of telepathy as very similar to Savant Syndrome. Just another skill that, yes, not everyone has access to, but some do. And we shouldn't discredit it just because we don't have access. We can see the effects. Like you can see the effects of Savant via me doing these tests and producing these tapes. Like you can see for yourself that this does exist. But then she went and said, oh, but 100% of people have this. And I was like, girl, why did you not just like say it's just these students? Like, I don't know if it's 100. Why take it there? You know?
Yeah, I think she's so well-meaning because it's the autistic people she's talking to telling her that like 100% of autistics have this ability.
Yeah.
And so she wants to give voice to them. So she's like, yeah, this is what they're telling me. So it must be true. But I get it. Like, I feel like she could have included that and be like, they say this.
Right.
Without being like,
it is
true.
this.
Yeah. There's a difference between like platforming versus endorsing. I think she definitely like endorsed every single line that came from the families and the autistic people, which I understand because she's wanting to give voice to them. But at the same time, she kind of lost her journalistic credibility in doing that.
Yeah. All right. I feel like I kind of know where you stand after all this.
Tell me where I stand.
I think you're happy that the telepathy tapes exists because it's obviously very popular. So it's brought a lot more awareness to this special interest area of yours. I think you obviously think in some areas she was off base or like misguided in maybe the language she was using or how she was presenting it. But ultimately that metaphysical stuff is real and you were just waiting to be proved correct.
Yeah, basically. Okay, I'm going to guess your take.
Okay.
You are happy you dove down this rabbit hole to learn about it. You think it's interesting. And you're like, oh, it's a nice thought experiment, but ultimately there's no there. Maybe there's like some sort of small abilities that are happening, but it could be explained just by like, oh, mother-child connection or something more feet on the ground than telepathy.
Yeah. Well, I want to believe in telepathy. I don't think this podcast convinced me. I guess like the super clear, like literally I'm reading your mind. Okay, I find a little harder to believe. Like I'm thinking of 8 numbers and you're going to repeat it to me exactly. But do I already believe that there's like connection or like vibes or, you know, like someone's feeling sad. Maybe you don't know they're sad, but you sense it somehow and you go and comfort them. Like I think that happens, you know, and that's to me kind of a form of telepathy, if you want to call it that, right? Like being connected to someone in that way. So I don't know. I just feel like the podcast didn't really deliver on that. Like I was really hoping, I was like really excited when you brought this up. I was like, yeah, I want to like research this. I want to like listen to it. I don't feel like she convinced me that telepathy exists. Although maybe that wasn't her point. Maybe that was what she was using as a cover. And really her point was more of this, much bigger conversation around consciousness and all this. Probably the most interesting and changed thing I'm walking away from this with is like, I think my thoughts on spelling have actually changed. Because I do think I was very much a skeptic in line with the rest of the consensus in the scientific community, even after I read Happiness Falls, as in like there are clear challenges with this way of communicating. And now that I have looked at the research myself, it's not that I think the pro side is that convincing. Like I said, everyone's forced to be really strong on their point of view. So they say like, well, we have 160 peer-reviewed articles supporting this. And I looked at those articles. I mean, not 160, but I looked at several of them and I was like, out of these 8 articles that you're saying support RPM, like 5 are with one person. Like it's literally like a case study. Another one is with 9 people. Another one, the takeaway is like, we just need more research. Actually, none of the studies are saying we definitively know that this is a good methodology. But I also don't think the opposite, like Asha's take, which is just like, because we don't know, you shouldn't be allowed to do it, is like right either, you know? So after looking at the videos with my own eyes, I do think I have a more educated take where I'm like, okay, yeah, like I understand the critique that maybe it's being intermediated or affected by someone else. But if I had an autistic person in my life and they wanted to communicate with me in that way, I would 100% believe that it was coming from them. From what I've seen, it feels ignorant and non-accepting of me to be like, that's not you. That's like someone else talking.
Yeah. And also like, why can't both things be true? Like, that's where I think a lot of this conversation gets lost is it's like, oh, either you're 100% for or you're 100% against. And why can't it be true that there are some people that have this ability and then like sometimes there are caretakers that are nudging them or like it's not actually working 100% of the time? That doesn't take away from the people that it's actually working for though. And like maybe we don't know the mechanism by which like that works for them and like not for other people. Or like maybe cognitive ability is different among every person, obviously. Or like, I don't know, there's like a million fucking different things that could be why it works for some but not others. But yeah, to your point, like if I had somebody in my life that was nonverbal, like obviously I would try. Are you kidding? Like, of course you would try.
Yeah.
And I don't think that should be like demeaned.
No, I don't think you should be labeled as like gullible just because you like one of the questions I came into this was like, how much of this is like hope and how much of it is science? Because obviously everybody in this podcast is so hopeful. And like we as listeners are hopeful too. Who doesn't want nonverbal autistic kids to be able to communicate and be able to have an inner life? You know, everybody wants that. I am kind of curious if that's why the language against it is so strong. Because I do feel like tonally it's really different. Like I feel like the pro people are just like, let us have a life, let us do more research. Like, why are you so against? And the people against are just like tonally like, no, this is so, so dangerous. And I wonder if that's because I mean, we saw it with this podcast, right? Like, people listen to this, they get hope, they try to do this with their own kid, and they're not trained, or I don't know what resources they're relying on, but then they call in and they say, my kid said this. And is that real? I don't know. Like, maybe that's the risk, is if these organizations are more like, we don't know if it's effective, we need more research, then they feel like they're not protecting vulnerable people.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, especially after that court case where it got completely demolished, you understand why, because it's like you're basically using nonverbal people as tools for your own agenda on some level. And like they do become pawns to whatever game you're potentially playing if you're untrained, if you have bad intentions. I totally understand the skepticism there and like the desire to protect. So I don't know. I think it's so tricky. It is so tricky because it's not even a hypothetical. It's not like we're saying, oh, it could happen that somebody gets taken advantage of. It's like, no, it did happen. And that's why this is viewed the way it is.
Yeah.
Very tough. I don't know the answer, but I think that's the point. What I like about this podcast is it's introducing skepticism and telling us that like we don't know the answer. I don't condone being like, oh my God, everybody has telepathic abilities and like this is 100% real and there's like heaven and God and whatever. But I do think introducing the nugget and being like, hey, like maybe there's some things here that we don't understand.
Yeah.
Healthy skepticism.
Yeah, totally.
And curiosity.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right.
See you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye. If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Our sources are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.